Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Leading Digital Transformation Interactive Q&A session. I'm Sandeep Mysore, Senior Lecturer in Information Systems and Technology Management at UNSW Business School, standing in for Associate Professor Sam Kirshner, your academic lead for this year's Learn to Lead, Leading the Future. I'm here with Professor Richard Webby, who will be answering all of your questions on digital transformation. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Camaragal people of the Euro Nation that are the traditional custodians of the land which I'm speaking to you from today in my home in Manly Vale. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet on, wherever we may be across the country, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today's interactive question and answer session is an opportunity for us to delve a little deeper into the topic of leading digital transformation, and you ask any questions you may have on this module. But before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted your questions. The questions I've seen revolve around the impacts, challenges, and potential strategies for implementation of digital transformation in organizations. I have handpicked the most popular question themes that I feel you will all benefit from, and Richard will answer those first. Now, after this, we will move on to real-time questions. You can post questions throughout the session using the Q&A function, and we will endeavor to answer as many questions as possible in the time that we have today. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the Learn to Lead Navigator platform following this session. And without any further ado, let's move on to the Q&A session. First up is a question that I'd like to personally ask Richard. So Richard, are you ready?
I'm ready. Good evening, everyone.
Perfect. Richard, what potential changes do you envision for the world in the next 10 years as a result of digital transformation? And how might these advancements reshape the concept of leadership and the required skills?
Yes, so as you heard in the first part of this module, there's three underlying enablers of all of this change, right? So they're just going to continue. So improved connectivity, processing power, data storage, those three fundamental enablers. I just think that those just continuing to improve. There may be some leveling off over the next 10 years. So they've already seen a little bit of leveling off of Moore's law, which is the law that was set out a long time ago. The computing power doubles every 2 years, so that may be starting to level off a little bit, but it's still exponentially increasing. So all of that, all of those three fundamental things are causing all of these technology trends that we are talking about practically every day in the news or in the media. So AI, of course, is probably the biggest one right now, generative AI and ChatGPT and Bard. So those are all driven by the developments that have happened over many years in AI technology and the development of large language models and the ability for mass amounts of data to be analyzed extremely quickly and at relatively low cost. So, we're starting to see more corporate adoption of those technologies, and that will continue to increase over the next 10 years. So I think we're going to see a lot more applications of AI, machine learning, those large language models. Right now, ChatGPT is a generic one, right? It's based on the training of all public data that it can access, and some private data that's been fed into it as well. But we're going to see a lot of separate ones coming by industry domain, by perhaps country, or perhaps by culture, and there's going to be sort of silos where there are those private ones that are connected to the public ones, like the ChatGPT one. So we're going to see a lot of continued transformation of front office roles, like contact centers. We're going to see a lot of back office processing being further automated by AI machine learning. And we'll still need humans, we'll need specialists in those areas, but there'll be probably a lot more done by computing. So already in big companies, there's around 25% of those workloads have been taken over by chatbots and rule-based processing. But generative AI is going to take that to the next level. So that's really powered by data. That's really powered by the processing power. Those two of the three big fundamental things. The other big trend, as you probably just saw less than 2 days ago, Apple announced a brand new product, their Vision Pro augmented reality headset, retailing at an incredible $3,500 US. So it's going to be north of $5,000 in Australia, and they look like ski goggles. My perspective is I'm sure it's going to be beautiful, smooth, incredible. I've seen a couple of reviews already, but I think it's still going to be somewhat niche. Initially, it's going to be focused on training applications and gaming applications. But ultimately, sometime in the next 10 years, we're going to finally get to a version of that looks more like regular glasses, right? The technology gets miniaturized. The capability of just seeing something on more like regular glasses becomes capable. I actually visited the offices of Meta, which was formerly known as Facebook, just late last year. They have been working for some time now on a partnership with Ray-Ban. Now, whether this is going to be impacted by all the layoffs that have happened in Meta, some of the roadmap might be further delayed, but they had publicly announced that they were going to develop AR-capable glasses by 2027. Right, it's only a few years away. But with 20,000 people laid off recently, who knows if that will happen? But maybe Apple will do it instead in 4 or 5 years. But so just imagine walking around a city with heads-up directions on your glasses. You're not looking at your phone anymore. You're actually looking at the environment around you. And then you come to talk to someone and you're in a foreign city and they're talking in a language you don't know, and you have subtitles. As they're talking, you get subtitles under them, like as on a TV, right, in real time. And now that would be pretty cool, right? You ask for directions and they tell you, and you see it in your native language on your glasses. But you're not gonna do that with the Apple headsets or the Oculus headsets, right? You're not going to walk around in the city with those on. But eventually, I think it will get to a socially acceptable kind of mechanism. So that's connectivity. That's the localization of computing power in a very, very small form factor, right? And that's ultimately leveraging all the connectivity to all the data of various services on the internet. So it's a kind of like an IoT kind of capability, which is another big trend. So to me, in terms of the other part of your question, the leadership that will be needed within companies, within governments to adopt some of those technologies for human good at the end of the day, hopefully human good, hopefully not AI taking over the world like Terminator 2. I think that all of these things will need to be adopted from a perspective of ethics, respect around privacy, and obviously caution around cybersecurity. But leaders will be required to balance those things with the speed of change, right? So that's where leadership comes in, overcoming the historical resistance to change. That's just sort of the inertia in organizations and in people that really don't want change, with also the need for some level of caution. But if you're so cautious, you can't do anything. You get paralyzed by that. So leadership will need to take the headwinds and the tailwinds and push these things along in the right direction, so that ultimately we get to, good outcomes for society. So yeah, those are the things I spoke about in the module around. You just have to have leadership will require to be good at pitching an idea in a company or in a social environment, an organization, government. You need to be able to organize people to build prototypes or some visual mechanisms to help people understand the concepts, and then ultimately making it commercial, making it work in the ecosystem of that company or that industry. So if you have those skills, you'll definitely be in high demand in the future.
Great, thanks for sharing your insights on that question, Richard. Really useful. Now I'd love to move on to the 3 questions that I've picked from the platform, which the participants have submitted. Now, the First question is from Yuki Kita Leong, who's a business alumni from Sydney. And they ask, how do you pitch, or what is an effective way to pitch to upper management or major stakeholders on the significance of digital transformation if met with resistance or inertia, something that you alluded to in your response previously?
Yeah, so my recommendation is that, and maybe because I'm a technologist at heart, and I've learned this the hard way, you don't start with the technology. You don't start talking about the technology. You know, you can give demos of the technology and so on. But if you pitch first about the customer needs, that was the shared customer insights building block in the module that I spoke about, that's from MIT. You speak about the business context, the business needs, right? So maybe it's not, the customer might not be a consumer, it might be an internal business customer. But you talk about the needs of the business, the needs of the customer, how things are trending, how things are evolving with the competition or the market for that, whatever good or service your company is providing. You don't talk about the tech first. So if you think about the Disney example, they focused on the customer challenges, the guest, as they call the customer in a hospitality context. So it was around the intent to return metric, which was like new guests or first-time guests were less than 50% likely to come back to Disney World because of all the hassles in the vacation experience, all of the humidity, long lines, anxiety around will my kids get on the ride or meet the princess. Those were the concerns and the anxiety at the end of that trip. That maybe they missed out on one of those important moments that they expected to have after spending, $4,000, $5,000. So you want to, in your company or your organization, sort of try to connect with your leaders and understand what are the leading indicators, what are the things that are suggesting where the company is going to go, not the lagging indicators necessarily, right? So, the profit last year is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. You want to look at things that are like, are the customers going to come back in 2 years, 5 years, whatever? Those are the leading indicators, and those will then be used in conjunction with what can be done with technology now to suggest what sort of digital transformations are viable for your company. And some of those might require some of those other building blocks to be developed, right? They might require digital platforms. They might require changes in accountabilities. So those are the other building blocks there. But to me, it's like a pitching about the customer, understanding competitive developments, understanding the business, and then knowing how the technology fits in, putting it into that context. You'll be more likely to be successful with the pitch. Right.
So put the customer insights first before the technology, and that's how you win over your stakeholders. Thanks, Richard. Moving on to the second question from James Chen, who is an engineering alumni from Sydney. You mentioned, the question goes, you mentioned the experimental nature of the digital transformation. I assume this will involve collecting data and learning through mistakes and failures, and subsequently learning from the mistakes and improving upon the system. Can you please give us some examples in Disney NGE where any mistakes led to an opportunity to improve?
Yes, there were certainly plenty of learnings in Disney's Next Generation Experience project. One was pretty close to me and my team, because the first part of the project that I was involved in was building out the digital components, so the website and the mobile app, the My Disney Experience app. And one kind of design mistake we made was that we believed that everybody would like to have Disney's suggestions through a recommendation engine, of which 3 fast passes they would like to go on every day, right? So we built an algorithm that actually reduced the amount of time that people would have to walk between the attractions to minimize the amount of sort of congestion in the theme park. And so we came up with this algorithm that if you You plugged in a few parameters about yourself, like we knew age of your kids, genders, or those types of things, interests. Then we would sort of turn out these 3 suggested fast passes. These are the fast passes that allow you to skip the long lines and go straight into whichever roller coaster or princess ride you wanted to go on. So we thought that would be the right way to do it, like showing, because it's sort of similar to how we sold hotel rooms. We would highlight the ones at the top that were recommended. Sometimes they were recommended because we wanted to sell them because they didn't had a lot of capacity. Sometimes they were recommended because we knew a bit about your prior shopping behaviors. Like you would book in the luxury hotels. So we'd show luxury hotels to you based on past experience. So we thought something very similar would work really well for fast passes, so what you want to do on the day. But it turns out that was totally wrong. People actually wanted to do the detailed planning and considering, so here's the 15 fast passes that you can do in that particular theme park, like Magic Kingdom. And they wanted to research it and weigh them up and decide for themselves and schedule their day in the way that they wanted to do it, right? So if they're young kids, they would maybe go back to the hotel and kids would have a nap and then they'd go back in later on. I mean, whatever people really customize that. And there's no way we had enough information to really provide good options for them. So we just ripped that whole thing out. We probably spent maybe $1 million of development on it or something. I don't know. So that was a kind of one big learning. I think the lesson out of that is don't make assumptions, really test, right? So if we got just basic prototypes in front of customers and had them about maybe 50 people run through it, perhaps we wouldn't have built it because we didn't just design it, we built it, right? Which that's where the cost came in. Right, and then we had to rebuild it in a different design. In a big company, that takes quite a lot of time and quite a lot of money because it involves a lot of people. So that was probably one big lesson learned. There was also other parts of the NGE program, like which are very optimistic and blue sky. Some money was spent on this idea that at the end of your maybe 7-day holiday, you would walk away with this digital photo album. But more sophisticated than just a photo album, it would be like all the things that you did, like you checked into the hotel, here was your room, like a real scrapbook in a digital sense. So there was a lot of concept work done on that. It wasn't built, but it ultimately came down to wasn't going to be viable. It was going to be so expensive technically to build, and people are already buying a $4,000 holiday and they're already getting their photos, a la carte sort of photos, for maybe $50 extra. They're going to spend $300 extra for this kind of scrapbook, or they're going to actually want to scrapbook it themselves. So that one, fortunately, wasn't built, but there was quite a lot of money spent on the design of it and thinking about it. So those I think it goes back to the message around understanding the customer. And so when you don't have something built, you don't necessarily have much data. And also if you're building something a little secretive, it's a little bit hard to test it as well. There was a lot of testing done, but there was definitely still a lot of lessons learned about kind of doing things like personas, understanding different types of customers. Right? So not every customer actually wanted to plan everything in advance before they got there. Right? That was also a bit of an assumption that people wanted to actually plan everything. Some people just wanted to buy the trip and just show up and have a good time and be kind of spontaneous in the moment. So the system has to cater to all different types of customers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Richard. Again, great insights. And I can personally relate to the planning aspect. I never plan very much, very ahead of my trips. Always, love to go there, explore, and see what works best given the day. Yep.
I'm a planner. I'm like a crazy planner. So. Probably that was factored into some of the design as well. That's a bias.
Great. So moving on to the last pre-selected questions, Richard. So this is from Marianne Pioli Martinez, who is a current student from Costa Rica. So her question goes as such: Regarding the implementation of the strategy, how can you increase the receptiveness of the different departments to adopt the new technologies, especially if they already have a different system that would need to be removed to take on the new integrated one?
Well, first of all, I really want to go to Costa Rica sometime. It's totally on my list, and I'm actually a bit sad I didn't get there when I was living in the US, because it was a heck of a lot closer. But anyway, I'll get there at some point. So I guess the question around the legacy systems and companies that have those embedded in the way that they work, in the way that they do their business today, but then maybe are not capable of doing some of the new digital, providing the digital offerings or the capabilities to build new innovative digital interfaces on top of, is a common one. Every single large company, and every medium-sized company as well, has a lot of those existing systems that weren't really built in the way that digital needs it to be built. So if you think about the Disney example, there were dozens of different siloed systems that couldn't handle the scale of the internet. They certainly couldn't handle the challenge of the My Disney Experience app, right, where we had to show a one-day itinerary with data coming from hotel systems, ticketing systems, FastPass systems, transportation systems. They were all different systems. They all had their own version of the customer. They all had their own business processes. And they weren't built for millions of 50,000 hits every minute, which would be like what would happen at the beginning of the day when people walked into a Disney park. So those systems we had to build. We couldn't replace them all. So we had to build this operational backbone and digital platform on top of that, right? So there was a lot of kind of fundamental platforming work that had to happen, we have to. If you're thinking about how you convince others, I think it's to leverage those types of concepts, to talk about how, whether you're technical or not, talk about this sort of operational pieces that you need to put in place just to run the business today more successfully, right? That's the operational backbone. That's sort of digitization, not digital transformation. That's how do you digitize the current business, right? How do you make the current business BAU work better? And some of that is just cleaning up the operational backbone, some of those legacy systems, and maybe putting a layer on top of them, and then building the digital components on top of that. So that's the sort of way that you don't have to necessarily replace every system, but you will have to integrate and build on top of them in a way that, like the Disney NGE project did. So I think it's about laying out that vision, working with a enterprise architect in your company, laying out that vision and trying to lay out a roadmap where you make incremental steps towards cleaning up that operational siloed spaghetti mess into a nice clean operational backbone, and ultimately building digital capabilities on top of that the digital platform that you create. So you'll need to do several of the building blocks kind of all at once, but in incremental steps. So you're not trying to make the operational backbone perfect before you need to fix the accountability framework, right? They all have to sort of lay out a roadmap of all 4 or 5 of those pieces evolving over time to get to where the ultimate vision is that you have in mind.
Right. Yep. Great insights again, Richard. Thank you so much for that. Now, we will move on to the live Q&A session. I've been monitoring the Q&A functionality, and there are many questions that have come in. Not surprisingly, quite a few questions centered around AI. So maybe I will, pick a couple of questions on the topic and its role in digital transformation. Unfortunately, we won't have the time to go through all of the questions, but I'll try to pick questions that are representative of the questions that we received today. So the first question is from Guresh Ahuja. So Guresh asks, do we need to be fearful of artificial intelligence enabled transformations? And how do we define our role in relation to these technologies?
So there's a lot of people are hyping it and running around being very, very concerned and very scared about it right now, and a lot of very, very experienced people that have been involved in the industry, people that have been building out these AI technologies are causing, sending off the alarm bells. So I don't think we should definitely not ignore them. That was my reference earlier about we need to build things ethically. We need to build the safeguards into the technology. We need to have the right regulation in place. So there's definitely work to do for the technology industry, government, and the regulators working together on those things to evolve the standards of how we want to work with and govern AI and related applications. But on the other hand, I'm an optimist. I'm quite optimistic. I've seen technologies. I've seen a lot of machine learning implementation, and it can be the main issue from my perspective is that you train AI on real data sets, and actually it sometimes develops biases based on real data sets because it's being trained on, like, for example, on thousands of messages in a chatbot context that humans have sent to human agents. And you're training the AI on the way humans actually respond to other humans. So that's inherently at risk of training in biases for the AI, because it will start responding in the same way, unfortunately, biased people do. But you've got to start somewhere. You've got to start with those concepts. And I think that if you look at what OpenAI has done with ChatGPT, there's a lot of aspects where you get to a point where no, I can't respond to that question. I can't give you that information because they've built some of those safeguards in. Some of those might not have been in ChatGPT 3, but they put them into ChatGPT 4. So I think as long as we're talking about, as long as we're aware of this, at least in the current evolution of the technology, which is these large language models and essentially it's machine learning, I think we can control that. Then the question then is, well, will we eventually get to sort of the point where the AI becomes truly self-aware, right? And the AI is then creating other AIs, right? So Terminator 2 kind of scenarios and skills, right? So I'm not good enough at predicting when that's going to happen or if that's going to happen. But again, I think it just goes back to making sure we put the right safeguards in place, and ensuring we don't have a Terminator 2 scenario where drones are getting controlled by some central AI and going berserk.
Yeah, let's hope we don't live to see that day. Okay, moving on to our second question. This is from Andy. Andy is asking a question about the digital transformation concepts that you introduced in Module 1. So he wonders how he can apply these concepts practically on a smaller scale project. So that's broadly the question that Andy is asking.
Yeah, so it's always challenging to provide an example that's going to relate to everybody, and clearly not most people, and I don't expect myself either to ever work on another $1 billion digital transformation project of the scale of what was done over 3 to 4 years at Disney World. So, I mean, I apply those concepts in my own work currently in a much smaller scale, but they're still relevant. So if you think about the concepts that were in those building blocks in the module, and by the way, I picked that particular digital framework, which was the MIT CISA, or Center of Information Systems Research framework. I could have picked one of about 10 others. All of the major consulting companies, McKinsey, BCG, PwC, Accenture, they all have digital frameworks as well. They emphasize different things. The MIT one is a bit more open source, a bit more accessible, I thought, and it's one I've used in practice as well, with good results in terms of leading a workshop, leading an offsite with my team, and sort of like, okay, let's talk about what we need to put in place in terms of changing accountabilities, in terms of this accountability framework concept. That's one of the building blocks. How do we need to change that to evolve our agile model of software development? What should the digital product manager be accountable for? How do we think about squads of people, like 7, 8, 10 people in a cross-functional team? What are they accountable for? What sits outside Agile in a big company doing digital transformation? All of those types of questions are under that accountability framework, processes and business components, and how you basically manage the work, manage the roles and responsibilities. Right? Who owns your web homepage in a company? That was even a question, right? In my current company, right? There wasn't clarity around that. That's the sort of simple thing. Who's accountable for the homepage of the main website, right? Is it marketing? Is it digital? Is it IT? Who's accountable for that page? Who's accountable for registering the domain name? All of those things, all of those types of things are accountability frameworks. So that becomes like very concrete, hopefully for everyone listening. But those are things that we do in our company. Someone registers the domain name. Someone makes sure that the website is up and running and monitored. Someone is responsible for the content in that part of the website or that part of the website, right? So that's the accountability framework. You can do that whether you're doing a big project or just day-to-day operations. And then the digital platform is the notion of, well, it sounds very technical, but it's actually more than just the technology. It's about the reusable business components, right? So how do you use wireframes in your UX design? How do you use personas in your user customer research to inform, what should be built and how it should be designed and how it should be built, right? So those are components, and you reuse them, and it's not just the software, it's not just the web frameworks or the mobile app, right? So those are all, hopefully there's things that you can draw down from those 5 building blocks that can relate to actually quite a small piece of work in a team, as well as something with 500,000 people working on something over 3 years.
Thanks, Richard. There's another question related to Module 1, where you spoke about building a business case for change. So the question is, how did you evaluate the impact of the do-nothing scenario and its financial impact?
Yeah, and it's worth always mentioning that's always an option, right? It's always got to be considered, like the do-nothing scenario. What if we do nothing? What will happen? Will become the next Xerox, or will we become the next company that's disrupted by competitors doing something else and consumers expecting something else? Or will we waste a ton of money if we invested, I don't know, $1 million in this digital transformation, $10 million in this digital transformation? And that's all those options. It's very important to lay out the options, and that should always be one of them. What if we don't make this change? What if we don't invest? What if we, of 3 or 4 or 5 different options you present up to senior management to make a case for change, there's always the do nothing. There's always just continue operating as is. And what are the risks associated with that? So you need to evaluate that against your company's business strategy, against the risk appetite. If you do nothing, what will ultimately happen?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a very important consideration, case scenario that one needs to consider while making a case for change. Thanks, Richard. Now, you alluded to, when you spoke about generative AI in some of the previous responses, you alluded to the data that is required to build such applications, and there are, of course, issues of privacy that will emerge when we are talking about generative AI. We're already seeing lawsuits and potential lawsuits from digital platforms where generative AI seems to be using the data from some of these platforms to inform its own development. There's one question from Kerry, which is related to this whole phenomenon. So clearly, government regulation is required here with the objective of protecting customer privacy and the use of their data. Do you think governments globally and here in Australia are currently alert to and well equipped to address these challenges, especially around the issue of generative AI?
Yeah, it's a complex question. It's a complex topic. If you think about it, generative AI is using publicly available data that's primarily on the internet today to build up its large language models, to build its knowledge base. So if you feed something into it, it becomes essentially in the public domain, into its regular chat GPT. Unless your company has set up an environment where it's running OpenAI technology in its own data center or its own cloud environment, right? If you're feeding something in there, certainly if you're feeding customer data into ChatGPT, or you're feeding your company's source code into that environment, it's almost like you're posting it on a website for anybody to see. So that's the sort of, I think, the framework you should consider when you're using that. So if you're happy having your resume publicly available, paste your resume in and ask for it to give you suggestions on improving your resume. That's probably fine. It's probably a reasonable use of it, because most of our resumes are fairly public. They're on, most of them are on LinkedIn in some shape or form. And so maybe that's not very confidential. Maybe you just want to edit out your birth date if you've got that on your resume, or anything sort of identifiable. So I think you need to start with that mindset as a person, and then the broader question around the government. Do they understand that? I don't think every citizen understands that. So I don't think the government understands that either. So I think it's a big, rapid education process that has to start happening, and sort of trying to myth bust as well, right? Like, the AI is not out to get you. It's just doing what it's been programmed to do based on the massive amounts of parameters and data observations. And in fact, if you've played around with it and got access to ChatGPT, you can change those parameters for your own use, right? So if you're a bit of a hacker, a bit of a developer, you can get into ChatGPT, and you can, because ChatGPT makes up a lot of stuff, right? It's got parameters that you can sort of make up a lot of stuff and be super creative or be super factual. You can actually adjust those parameters if you go under the hood, right? It's just like when you're driving a car, you can adjust the way the carburetor works, right? You can adjust the ChatGPT sort of making stuff up parameter. And I think that's just it's an evolution in education and mindset and awareness that has to happen in societies, in governments, in citizens around all of these technologies, from cybersecurity to AI to, augmented reality, all of those things, in terms of the risks and the benefits, and how to govern them and navigate through them.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. I think that's insightful. I think we have just time for one last question. This question is from Tariro Makwasha. And the question is, given the exponential growth and acceleration in fundamental enablers for digital transformation, how can we as leaders position organizations for agility when skills, costs, and overall resources are likely to be overrun?
Yeah, well, that's an incredible question, a great one to end with as well, I think.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that's where the right combination of those building blocks needs to come together in the context of your organization, in the context of what market and what customer you're providing those services to, because you always will have finite resources, and it'll always ultimately come down to priority calls, right? Do you invest in setting up an agile squad or a set of agile squads, changing accountability frameworks and giving more empowerment to teams to do their own thing, rather than kind of being in the traditional kind of organization, right? Do you spend time setting that up? Is that going to give you a benefit? Is that going to give you a return on investment? Do you focus on resolving the legacy systems and upgrading from this version to that version to reduce vulnerabilities and give you more agility and more features for current business users, improving BAU, right? Those are all things that you have to govern, leaders have to govern in organizations and make the case for prioritizing this over that. Because if you have you always have a finite amount of OpEx, finite amount of CapEx in an organization. It's government, it's the same thing. You have limited budgets. You can make the case for going over the budgets if it's really strong, get additional capital, but you've got to really make a good case. Right, so it is a prioritization call, and that's where leadership comes in. Like this is, explaining why this is really important from a customer and business strategy perspective. Going back to the kind of linking back to the first question, right? Yeah. So I think that is where your skills as a developing leader can really make a big difference in organizations. It's really how do you tie customer, business, and technology together with that building block concept so that you can advocate for obviously ultimately a successful career for yourself, but also for that company, that organization to move forward and remain viable. So I wish you all the very best in that journey. It's certainly been an incredible one for me for 30 years or so. And hopefully met many more. And I hopefully our paths will cross at some point. So all the best.
Thank you so much, Richard. Now it's unfortunately time for us to wrap up. We are at the end of the session. And thank you again, Richard, for patiently answering all the questions. And I'd like to, of course, thank you all for tuning in and asking such engaging and thoughtful questions. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. The next live session will be tomorrow night, a Q&A with facilitator Travis Rice, Senior Manager, Multimedia and Immersive Technologies UNSW, as part of Module 2, Leading with Technology. I hope you continue to enjoy the course. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thanks, Sandeep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard.